What sort of gains might we get if we started reforesting degraded grasslands and degraded forests in the tropics? Hard to get figures on that, very little work's been done. But generally people would consider that if we can't be sequestering 5 gigatons of carbon, 5 billion tonnes of carbon a year a couple of decades from now in regrowing tropical forests, we're not really trying. And that's a significant gain. It's half of the total emissions for this year. I'd like to turn away from tropical forests now to much more broadacre approaches that are probably more directly relevant to Australia. Most of the world's land surface is too dry or the soils are too poor for either agriculture or to support tropical forests. And those lands are now by and large used by humans, at least the better of them, for pastoral practices, for cattle grazing, sheep grazing and so forth. And there's been a very sorry story there of land degradation. And of course, as lands are overgrazed, soils are exposed, carbon is lost. But with relatively small modifications of farming practices, enormous gains in soil carbon can be made, and with those gains in soil carbon come a whole lot of other benefits that make rangelands very valuable assets indeed. There are farmers in Queensland at the moment who are they're practising a very, very simple intervention in the way they deal with their rangelands, and that intervention is just that following good rains, they keep their livestock off the pasture for between 4 and 8 weeks, because by that stage the plants have grown up sufficiently to protect themselves and nourish their roots. You can put the stock back on, and they don't damage the plants anything like as much as they do if you put the stock on earlier, and you get enhancements of soil carbon, enhancements of soil moisture, and decreases in methane emissions from the cattle, because the cattle have got better forage through the year. Now, these practices are not quite as simple as that. They involve getting the right mix of what's called C3 and C4 grasses and woody plants the cattle can eat, and trees as well. But once you start managing the rangelands at that sort of level, the potential for carbon sequestration is enormous. If we could increase the carbon content of the world's dry rangelands by just 2%, we would be sequestering 800 gigatons of carbon. That's a lot of carbon. 800 billion gigatons of carbon. So those sort of interventions, again, are extremely valuable tools in this fight to stabilise our climate. One of the most interesting of the applications we may make in future to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere concerns a very humble substance, charcoal. Just last week I came back from a conference in the United Kingdom where the world's charcoal experts had gathered, all 200 of them, and they were a pretty motley crew, I can tell you. There was people interested in worms and people interested in all sorts of strange things that you wouldn't ever imagine. But the message that came out of the conference was extremely interesting. And I can perhaps encapsulate it best to you by just telling you a story about the conference. There was a Swedish agronomist there who was working on developing a machine which he called a charvester. Now, this charvester of his, in his mind, it doesn't exist yet, but he's on the way to producing it, is sort of like a harvester for crops. And you put it in a paddock where you've got your wheat crop that you want to harvest, and it'd go along and harvest the wheat crop all right for you, but it would also take the crop waste, the stalks of the wheat plant, and it would put those into what's called a pyrolysis machine. And that pyrolysis machine would just it allows the biological material to be heated in the absence of oxygen, and at one end of the machine you get a crude oil substitute coming out, which is the hydrogen-rich end of the plant stuff. At the other end you get charcoal. Now, the charvester would go along harvesting the crop. It would give the farmer his wheat crop, it would give him a few barrels of crude oil at the end of it, and would give him some charcoal that would be sowed back into the soil as the charvester goes along. The charcoal studies have shown consists of about 35% of the carbon in those plants that were put into the pyrolysis machine, so a little bit under half. But charcoal is a really special material. It's not like biological carbon. It's not like volatile carbon. You and I, or that wheat straw, if once it dies and is left out in a field, we disappear into the atmosphere pretty quickly. At least all the carbon in us does. But charcoal's not like that. The charcoal stays around for a very long time, and I'm a paleontologist by training. I've used carbon-14 dating all of my professional life, and I know that that charcoal can be thousands of years old in the soil, and it's the only thing left of organisms that grew thousands of years ago. Everything else has rotted away and gone back to the atmosphere. The reason that happens, of course, is that the biological carbon is mineralised in the process of charcoal formation. That mineralisation stabilises it and makes various nutrients available to plants. So the charcoal goes back into the soil. The results are you get better soil acidity, better soil acid balance. You get better soil moisture retention because the charcoal is cellular, and any rain that falls is likely to be held in it. That also means that farmers use less fertiliser because it just sticks around longer. There's also less emissions of nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And the upshot of all of that is that with less inputs, you get less greenhouse gas emissions and a better crop next year. So the potential of these char-based technologies is just enormous in terms of feeding the world, increasing our food security and dealing with the climate problem. It's hard, again, to understand at what scale these sort of processes could operate were they to be adopted worldwide. The best estimates we have that were made last year were that if biochar was adopted aggressively globally, by 2030 we could be sequestering 10 gigatons of carbon per annum as charcoal in the soil. So you can see where I'm going with this biological carbon. There is the potential to sequester and permanently store away vast amounts of atmospheric carbon by using plants. And the frustrating thing for me at the moment is that our political dialogue seems to be just ignoring this. We are quite rightly focused on emissions reductions. We have to get those emissions reductions right, and we have to get them at a much more aggressive level than we're currently pursuing them in the proposed carbon trading schemes and so forth that we're looking at. But we will not win this battle, I think, unless we deal with the advantages that biological carbon offer us in terms of drawing the pollution out of the atmosphere. I tend to sort of call that basket of approaches, if you want, the tropical forest, biochar and rangelands, an approach of atmospheric cleansing, because it's not really about emissions reductions, it's about drawing some of the pollution out of the atmosphere. So I think that those proposals need to be looked at very seriously, both nationally here in Australia and globally. I'd like to just say that as this problem deepens, as the climate problem deepens, and it's pretty clear that whatever we do for a couple of years, things are going to get worse. It's good to have a positive view of what we're setting about to do, because that is immensely empowering. There's nothing worse in terms of trying to get something done than despairing. And I think one of the things that's helped sustain me as I've sort of pushed on with this whole battle in the light of ever worsening figures is the sense that this moment really marks an important moment in time for humanity. You know, if you look at our planet, it's been around as a living planet for around about 4 billion years, and all of its miraculous self-regulation that makes it suitable for life has resulted from evolution by natural selection, and that's a blind process, basically, of trial and error. But when we sat together in Kyoto to try to nut out last century the Kyoto Protocol, what was temptingly within our grasp was the possibility of using our human intelligence to regulate the gaseous composition of the atmosphere and thereby to regulate some of the most critical of Earth processes in relation to the sustainability of life. It's pretty humbling to me to think that it's this generation that task has fallen to. We're the people who could truly become Earth's intelligence. And I don't say that lightly. I know it sounds somewhat mystical. But I believe ever since the moment that we saw our planet from space, when Voyager went off and photographed our planet as this tiny blue speck in the vastness of space, Earth has had an intelligence. We've been able to comprehend our planet. And our intelligence is Earth's every bit as much as my brain is my body's intelligence. I think I'm a reasonably intelligent person, but I don't think my toe's very intelligent, you know. Earth has an intelligence. It's not widespread through the planet. It resides with us. And the enormous privilege of regulating some of Earth's processes for the benefit of life on the planet is one of the really sustaining beliefs for me. I guess I feel that humanity's always been destined to do this sort of thing because evolution has kept on throwing up command and control systems and intelligence through time. It just so happens that our intelligence will be used for the good of the entire planet if we get things right. Scientists talk a little bit about something just that I want to leave this discussion on. Talk about the Anthropocene. You've probably heard discussions of this. The Anthropocene geologist believes a new geological period that's marked by the pervasive influence of humanity on our planet. So far, that influence has been mostly destructive. Yeah, we know, we can see the result of that through time. I think we need a new definition of the Anthropocene and one we should celebrate, perhaps come the meetings in Copenhagen next year or whenever we get things right. The Anthropocene should really be marked on the day that we use our intelligence for the better, on that day when we get together and manage to agree to regulate the gaseous composition of the atmosphere for the common good. That's when I reckon a true new geological age will have dawned. Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there and open the floor to questions.
Tim, thank you. That certainly was very thought-provoking and challenging, and I think towards the end, or even through the middle, there were some very strong positive messages of hope, and I think that is something that we really have to grasp onto. Tim is happy to answer some questions from the audience. So if you could just raise your hand. Yes, please. Yes.
Thanks, Tim, for a positive talk. I don't know if you're aware that the World Sustainable Building conference was on this week in Melbourne, and it's just concluded this afternoon. It was a pretty sobering conference with a lot of people talking about how we can get to a point of mitigation for climate change, but it almost felt through the conference that the discussion was getting to a point of adaptation and needing to actually deal with eventual climate change. I wondered if you could answer maybe just your view on the importance of the construction industry to the challenges that we face in, I suppose, mitigation, but also the increasing reality that it really is adaptation and protection from the elements in a very real sense, or maybe even interaction with the elements that we've not sort of had before. And your views on that and our changing lifestyle and our changing decisions.
Okay, sure. Look, can you just wave your hand about? I'm sorry, I was a bit distracted because I couldn't see you. Thank you very much. That's great. Look, the one thing I didn't get to talk, there's two things I didn't get to talk about this evening, renewable energy and the importance of the new energy forms that we're developing now, and the other is that issue of energy efficiency. And it's in the built environment that we can achieve enormous things in terms of energy efficiency. The proposal that's been put forward today by various groups to the Rudd government that the money from the carbon trading scheme that's going to be given to underprivileged families, or those at the lower income end of things, that be given in terms of efficiency gains in buildings. In other words, perhaps more insulation or better light globes or more efficient white goods or whatever, is a fantastic idea. We need to make big gains in efficiency because it's relatively cost effective to do so. We need to make those gains if we're to have a hope of stabilising and then reducing our emissions. So the building industry is one of the big areas. I think about 70% of our emissions come from cities. So, and it's no coincidence that groups such as the Clinton Climate Foundation are focusing very much on cities for the solution. So I think that's a really important part of the deal. If I could just talk briefly about adaptation. I've always felt, that we can do a few things with adaptation. There's a few no-regret strategies and common-sense things that can be done. But, the big question is adapting to what? We don't know the extent of climate change yet, And I must say, when I think about adapting to a world where sea levels are 4 metres higher than they are today, I just can't see how we'd ever do that, So I think too much is made of adaptation. I think, for me, the big fight is around mitigation. It's about getting the gas out of the air and reducing the emission stream.
Hi Tim, it's Sharon Johnson, and thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Question I have, we talk a lot about technologies, but my concern is that I don't see people's behaviours changing. And I'd like to hear your comments about that, because that truly underpins a real change in the climate change issue.
Yeah, that's true. Well, people's behaviours, my God, if we wait for that to change, hell will freeze over before we get anything, I think. I don't know. You're right, it would be great to see people's behaviour changes. My great fear, of course, is it'll only change once we start to see dangerous climate change occurring. And, the analogy for climate change, there's some really good medical analogies for it. And high blood pressure is a great one. I went to my doctor a couple of years ago and he said to me, "My goodness, you've got high blood pressure." And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm feeling pretty good though." And he said, "Yeah, that's right, you'll feel okay, but if you don't take these pills for the rest of your life, one a day for the rest of your life," he said, you stand a high risk of having a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. And I was stupid enough to say to him, "But look, what are the symptoms of these things, heart attacks and stroke?" He said, "This is the symptom. Take the pills and get out of my office, And climate change is a bit like that, We're not feeling it now, but the deterioration in the climate system is there and we can measure it scientifically. So getting people to change behaviourally now is a bit like the challenge you've got with someone who's got hypertension or something, People have to understand they've got to act now while they're feeling okay and before the climate system starts to deteriorate. And that, it seems to me, is an enormous challenge.
Hi Tim, Tristan Knowles from Economists at Large. Just wondering what your thoughts are on the legal political changes that might be required to live in a sustainable world, just with regards to, say, preservation of tropical forests or any ecosystem. The current issue that I would see is that as governments change and political pressure changes, what was a policy that made sense initially may be disregarded by a change in administration, and what institutions or legal ramifications might make that change that to make it a more sustainable approach.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't think there is a single answer to it. Where we're dealing with volatile carbon, for example, like the tropical forests, where the work of decades can be undone in a few years if people change their approach. There you've got to have safeguards, and in some ways those safeguards can be produced by an approach akin to insurance. So if we had a large portfolio of carbon assets across the range and we had some sort of insurance built in to that, some excess carbon built into it, you might be able to deal with an area or a country or a village that decided to default on the deal. But, the thing that gives me hope with carbon trading is that I use eBay a bit. I don't know whether you use eBay, but I use it a little bit to buy things. And, I've bought stuff from people from a totally different legal jurisdiction who I've never met and I never will meet, and I'd have no way, really, of coming back if they didn't come through with the goods. And yet the default rate on eBay is minuscule. It's tiny. And it's built around the common trust of revealing the trading record of people. So if you reveal a village's trading record, and they have been defaulting, they'll never get another deal. Yeah. So there are mechanisms outside a sort of big brother global legal approach that can be extremely effective, I think, in terms of safeguarding investments like that.
I was today at a meeting in Yarram where the local irrigators are dealing with falling water levels of about 1 metre a year. And I guess groundwater is often seen as a reliable supply of water when surface water isn't as secure. And groundwater is that connection that you were talking about between the lithosphere, the atmosphere and water. Do you have any comments about groundwater supply and water security?
Well, I'd just say that everything's connected to everything else on the earth, and the groundwater's connected to the surface water. You know, particularly in Australia, most of the flow, for example, in the Murray-Darling Basin doesn't occur between the banks of the river. It's subsurface flow as well. And I guess it's been one of the great failings of our regulatory system in terms of water that we've dealt with groundwater as separate from water in the river channel. So, at the time we were giving out allocations of water out of the river channel, as that started to tighten up, farmers were perfectly entitled to put a bore down beside the river and draw out the groundwater, which in fact was the same water as the water in the river channel, all being connected. In terms of falling groundwater, though, Australia is not unique in suffering that problem. We're seeing an increase in the rate of evapotranspiration globally, particularly in the tropics and subtropics. And wetlands and such lakes and so forth are drying out all around the world at the moment as a result of that change. And we're seeing dramatically decreased stream flow in many of the world's evaporation control basins. The Murray-Darling Basin's a perfectly good example of that. We've seen a small decrease in rainfall, but a very large decrease in stream flow. And part of that is down to changed rates of evapotranspiration. So that's a very clear manifestation of climate change.
Tim, thank you for an excellent talk. You mentioned that a third of the mercury in the environment is liberated by burning of coal. And I understand also quite large amounts of radioactive elements are liberated into the atmosphere from coal burning as well. Do you have a position or an estimate or an idea of the relative risk of the amount of radioactivity is liberated from coal compared to what might be liberated from a modern nuclear reactor? Sure. Analysis.
Look, I've got some figures on that, but just in terms of a preface to that, the answer, coal is a sponge, effectively. It acts as a sponge in the ground. So any elements that are water soluble and moving through the groundwater tend to get trapped in coal, and then when we burn the coal, those elements are released to the atmosphere. So the mercury in coal, the mercury that's in our fish that's coming from coal burning, it's a very interesting process of what happens. We burn the coal, we liberate the mercury, which is in mineral form and therefore not very dangerous. It drifts out over the ocean, falls to the surface of the ocean where it still remains pretty innocuous, but then gets carried down into the ocean depths where bacteria transform it, or they methylate it. They turn it into an organic form, which is then extremely dangerous. And that tends to accumulate in small planktonic life in the ocean, and that planktonic life migrates. They might live 2 kilometres down during the day, but they go up at night. And then they're eaten by bigger fish, the sort of stuff that we catch, and they end up right back on our dinner plate. So that cycle from the coal-fired power plant to the ocean depths and back again is an amazing global cycle, but one which just illustrates very well that everything's connected to everything else. In terms of the question of radioactivity, uranium really is a very mobile mineral, a water-soluble mineral, moves and accumulates in coal very readily. I don't have any global figures on how much radiation is released, but what I can tell you from my time in South Australia is that we were trying to get an idea of how much radiation would be generated by the Olympic Dam mine development, which is the world's largest uranium mine, or will be the world's largest uranium mine. But we also had in South Australia a tiny little coal-fired power plant called the Playford plant up near Port Augusta, only 500 megawatts, small little thing. Have a guess which was the bigger point source of radiation? It was the coal-fired power plant, because the coal in South Australia, of course, is quite close to some of these uranium-bearing rocks. So it was a very relatively intense plume of radiation coming from Playford relative to the uranium mine.
I think we've got time for two more quick questions. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm just wondering about your thoughts on carbon trading and whether or not you think that industries like aluminium should be pardoned from carbon trading.
Well, what the aluminium people would say is that they are trade exposed, so that if we whack a tax on them, that their competitors overseas would take over the market or they'd go offshore. Now, I guess, I suppose if I had my way, if I was the sort of Prime Minister, what I'd be saying to is, we want you to stay in the country, but you're going to have to pay a carbon tax. We might incrementally raise it over time, but we will give you assistance to source the electricity you want from cleaner, renewable resources. Geothermal energy would be an ideal one for that. I understand the economic argument they make, but I think we're not perhaps being quite creative enough as we go forward to look at least the medium term of the carbon trading scheme.
I know it's a huge issue, complex, but what in short's your view of the use of nuclear energy?
Look, nuclear power is almost certainly going to be a significant element in the portfolio of power generation for large parts of the world. And you can see that happening today. China is going full steam ahead with new nuclear power development, and I must say I'm very glad about that, because otherwise it's going to be coal, but even at the speed they're moving, they're going from 1% of their generation nuclear to 3%. Europe's the same. You look at Britain now has renewed interest in nuclear power. And that's happening because in those parts of the world there just isn't the abundance of alternatives that we have in Australia. I don't think nuclear power will ever be used in this country just because we're a nation of 20 million people, and look at the sunlight we've got. We've got one of the world's best 2 or 3 wind provinces. We've got the world's best geothermal energy province. We've got some of the world's most reliable wave resources. So here we're so rich in renewable energy. I think that should be seen as our true strength, and we should be putting efforts into making a transition to that. Places like Europe and China don't have those advantages. But the reality is that, as I said, China, where would they go for energy now? They've got an immediate energy shortage. It's far from a desirable outcome, but we have to live in the real world, and we have to deal with this emissions reduction problem as effectively as we can.
The last question.
In Australia, I think Wes Stein from the CSIRO said 35 square kilometres of desert dedicated to solar generation would power the whole of Australia by 2020. So I thought it was interesting that you've only, at the end of your talk, come on to solar, where I really think it's a prime importance in this whole issue.
Yeah, look, I suppose in response to that, I did mention in the first question, I just didn't have a chance to, because of time constraints, look at the whole of renewable energy question. But I've had the great privilege in the last year to meet Dr. Shi Rongzhong, who runs solar tech in China. He's reputed to be the wealthiest individual in China today, built his wealth from making solar panels. And he told me that his ambition was to have solar power cost competitive with coal in China in 5 years. Now, if he can achieve that, he'll change the world. I don't know whether that's feasible or not. I haven't seen the figures, but I think there's no doubt solar's going to be in the mix there somewhere. But, electricity is a generic product. You can generate some right now by just moving your bum back and forth on a seat, if you've got a plastic seat there. There's a lot of ways of generating electricity. Solar's one of them, and I'm not really certain which one is going to win out in the longer term. But, as I said, in Australia's case, the renewables are clearly in there.
I'd like you all, please, to join me again in thanking Tim for what has been a truly stimulating lecture with that element of hope. And I think you can tell from the level of questions, the incredibly deep questions that have been asked, and the very thoughtful answers that Tim has given, that he really is on top of his subject. And I think in scientists like Tim, I think we have hope for the future. I'd like you to thank Tim.